Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Introduction to Validation. In this video, we're going to talk about what and why of the validation. What is it? What's it all about? We're going to talk about the three types of validation in programming. And finally, we're going to have a little discussion on how to use controls to possibly reduce the need for validation. Okay? So let's dive into this. What and why? Why are we doing this? What's validation all about? Well, up to this point, we have allowed our input to enter our programs that could be bad or would cause issues. Meaning, up to this point in this course, you have written programs that basically will accept any type of data, especially from a text box. That data, based upon what you inputted, it can either work or it wouldn't work. Meaning, in some cases, you're entering data that's going to be part of calculations, right? And if you entered ABC, for instance, in a text box that required a number to do calculations, you would get what's called an exception. You may have seen this. If you press submit without actually entering data that's going to be used in a calculation, you would get this exception. The program would literally blow up. It's called an abnormal ending, or it throws in an exception. Whatever you want to call it of those three, that's truly what it does. Up to this point, I've allowed it because we haven't gotten to the point of learning how to validate our inputs, okay? But in real worlds, we don't want to do that, okay? This cannot happen. Users of applications do not understand exceptions. Now, you may have seen some of these exceptions when you actually use software, but let me tell you, we don't want them, and we want to eliminate them completely. So we need to make sure that we validate all of our inputs. As I mentioned, if you're asking why we didn't validate before, we really needed to get to conditional programming to actually write the validations effectively, okay, and correctly, okay? So that's why we validate. So what we want to do now is make sure that all our input is good, that we cannot get to a point that the program breaks because a user enters the input incorrectly. All right, so what we need to do is validate all input data. We need to ensure that every piece of data that comes in is good and it can be used in calculations. It can be a couple different ways of validating and so on, but for the most part, we just want to make sure that whatever we expect that comes in our program, we got to take control as programmers so the user does it correctly. We can't assume that the users are going to do it correctly at all. Okay, but we also don't want ever the program to break because they happen not to do it correctly. We just got to give them a message that it's not correct. You guys have been, you guys have filled out forms, tons of forms in your life, all right? And basically when it comes to that, you have been validated, right? That all of a sudden you forget to enter this, you forget to enter that, or you entered this incorrectly. You've been validated on these forms. It's the same thing we're doing here. We need to make sure that the data is correct, okay? When it comes to validation, the requirements of a program usually defines what and how an input needs to be validated. So we normally don't make this up. Usually as part of the requirements, so being the problem that we give you or the problem that's being asked of you at your place of work, they'll tell you what needs to be validated. If you don't know, ask. Always ask. How should we accept this data? Is it required? Is it, and so on, okay? So based upon those requirements, validation usually falls into these three different types of categories. I say usually, somebody might want to come up with something new here, but as always, for most part, falls into these types of categories: existence, data types, and range, okay? For existence, basically what we're doing is asking the question that, say first name is required. Say your first name and last name is required on a form, okay? And they don't supply it. That's existence. So we as programmers need to check to make sure it's there. And if it's not there, we're going to give them an error message saying your first name is required. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is basically, does it exist? Okay, and so there may be certain types of information or data that's entered or that can be entered that's not required. Okay, again, it comes back to the requirements of the actual program. But if first name and last name is required, you do so. You've probably seen that on forms. Sometimes I see web forms that have a little asterisk by it that says, this part's required. And there's other things that may not be required, maybe the second line of an address and so on. And so it really comes down to, once again, the requirements of what's being asked of you. Data type basically says, okay, based upon this text box or this piece of data, does it meet the data type that's required for the program? Most of the time, it's a number. If it's supposed to be a number, is it a number? If it's not a number, tell people, you got to tell them to enter a number here. Okay, so we basically had different examples here and there. Base price in BB Auto Center, where base price needed to be a number. And if we allow people to enter anything else in there, it's going to cause errors. So they cannot enter ABC because it's going to throw that exception like we talked about before. The last one is range, okay? Does it meet the range of a criteria? What, is it greater than 1? Is it greater than 0? Is it between 10 and 60? Whatever the requirements are. Not every type of piece of data has a range requirement to it, meaning we don't need to check for it, but potentially may need to check for range. So like base price, for instance. I would think if you're buying a car, it needs to be at least greater than 0. So that one might be our range, that it's greater than 0. Okay, based upon what you're doing, we even say it should be greater than 10,000. We don't sell a car less than $10,000, so we should validate that it's $10,000 or above, whatever the requirements actually ask of you. Okay, it could be a string type thing. That did you enter A, B, or C? Okay, or did you enter a certain name or a certain type of a string in there? So that could be range also. This all fits under the range validation. Make sense? Usually when we deal with range, though, a lot of the times it's numeric. Does it meet this, is it greater than 0? Is it greater than 1? Is it between these certain numbers and so on based upon our inputs? But there's going to be times where we need to validate for, did you enter A, B, or C? That's what I asked you to do. Either A for this, B for this, or C for this. And you need to validate that it's one of those three. And if it's not, you'll give, once again, an error message to your user. Make sense? When it comes to validation, every piece of input could fall into either one of these categories, 2 of these categories, or all 3 of these categories. And so we need to understand how to write it for that, okay? So, and then once again, how do you know? The requirements will tell you what should be there. If I sit back and I give you an assignment and say first name is required, existence is the only thing you need to check for. If I sit back and I say this number, like base price, it's required and it must be numeric and it must be greater than 10,000, all 3 of these must be checked for that particular entry. Make sense? When developing this video, one of the things I wanted to make sure that we talk about, though, is that we have an opportunity as programmers to utilize controls, right, to minimize the need for validation. Nobody likes to get an error message. I contend that probably everybody out there listening to this video right now, when you fill out a form and all of a sudden you press enter and you get that red error message or something, it's frustrating. We don't like that, right? We don't like getting errors because then we have to go back and do more work usually. Based upon the program, it might clear out everything and you have to re-enter it all again. That's really frustrating, and that's also poor programming. But for the most part, we don't like getting errors. We want to we want to enter our data quickly and easily, and with the minimum amount of potential errors that we can do so. When I say we, in this case, as a user, okay? So we can do that a little bit by using controls, correct? And so instead of having everybody enter everything, our GUI allows us to use controls that we can select things, right, versus type things in. All right, so meaning like the check boxes, the radio buttons, which you've already been introduced to, combo boxes that you'll be introduced later on. And there's other ones out there. There's the date picker that you guys might be familiar with. I'm trying to think of other things. There's probably other things out there you've seen that we can use that and make it easier for people to enter the data without potentially making an error, right? That makes sense. But regardless of all those cool controls, you should consider them to eliminate the possibility of errors. There's going to be times where users have to enter data freeform, and those controls will not work. Therefore, it'll be in a text box. And when that's the case, usually we're going to have to validate that data. okay, one way or the other, based upon what we're going to be doing with that data. Does that make sense? All right. So that's kind of what I want to make sure you understand. This is not very hard. There's nothing hard about it. We're going to have to write some logical programs, okay, some conditional programming code to validate the data prior to doing the calculations. In the next video, we'll go in and see how this all works, and I'll show you what to do. In a lot of cases, what you'll be able to do is cut and paste what I'm going to show you and apply it to your programs.